All right, it's good to be back and to be this is the second of the Cozad 150 things that we're doing here. The museum has agreed to do a series of programs this year related to Cozad and to Robert Henri. And so this one tonight, as Corey said, we used our symposium in 2021, but most of you weren't there, so this is all going to be new to you. The story of the Cozads is it's a many layered story in Robert Henri. It takes many twists and turns, but invariably all of this comes together in a form of connections. It's one of my favorite things to talk about when I lecture on history is connections between events or people, and this is certainly one of those things. I just want to tell you a little about what we have now. So if you are really interested in this, in September, October, I think, the book that I are almost finished writing now will be available, and that's the order form for if you're interested. It's going to be 500 pages. All my books are too wordy. And I think I'm going to guess $25. We don't know yet, but it's going to be in that range. 75 pictures in it, and it will be the most detailed book ever written on the Cozad, Robert Henri's time here. And it'll be the first book in almost 45 years since Mary Sandal's book came out that talks about all this. And we've had access to a lot of new information since her book came out. So there'll be a lot of new information. And in fact, a lot of information kind of straightening out or correcting, I have to be diplomatic when I say that, but kind of getting the record straight. Because there's some major stories that have been told about Don Cozad, Johnny Cozad, that just are not true. And we have all, myself included, at least when I first came to the museum, I've told those stories. And so one of them, it's a sneak preview, Johnny Cozad, this is Robert's older brother, is said to have tried to burn down all of Lexington or Plum Creek then. And that's true, but it's not true. For one thing, he created a firebomb and it had a fuse on it, and it would burn the whole hotel down in an hour. And so that did not happen. The fuse went out. And so he's arrested up in Greeley, Colorado, next day. And the owner, for whatever reason, said he had burned the hotel down, which did not happen. But that's the story that has come forward. So that's the kind of stuff that we're going to try, hopefully correct in the book. And on the handout, the bibliography, so Robert Henri's had a lot of things written about him over the years, but I would say the two best books are the one by William Ennis Fuller and the other one by Bernard Crewman. And I say I misspelled Mr. Crewman's name, it's E-R. But anyway, those are the two best books. And as you can see, it's been a long time since there's been a biography of Robert Henri written. And that's something that really needs to be done. My interest is only in the Nebraska chapter, and these are some of the other works written about as well. The top one by Edges, it said that book was said to be written about Robert Henri. It's a novel, and then the only book that Robert Henri did write or was compiled by Marjorie Ryerson was The Art Spirit. And in our schedule later this summer, we're going to be talking about the Art Spirit at the museum on July 27th, and we're going to talk about the history. The book is 100 years old this year, so we're going to talk about the history of it, and then walk you around, whoever comes to the lecture, around to show the various. So, for example, he says, "Here's how you paint eye, or face, or hair." We'll be able to do that. So, and then the 8, of course, are prominent people. So that's one of the series of books, and we're building a new exhibit right now on the 8. And then lastly, there's a few articles there on the back side. Of course, there are at least 2 websites, one Henri Robert and then ours, which tell the story. So anyway, that's a little bit of background information. So the Cozads in terms of their lifestyle, were constantly traveling, roving, creating new lives. And this happened frequently, the marriage of John Cozad and Teresa Gately Cozad. I don't know that she ever thought when she got married to him that that's what she bargained for. She lived in, you can see these are the workplaces that I'm going to talk about. And then if you throw New York City in there, there were 5 different homes that she had to make. And several of them were in the middle of nowhere, being one Cozad being one of them. So, but this is kind of the network of travels across America that the Cozads did. So most of us here, and I certainly felt this way the first year or so that I was here, only think of Robert Henri through the lens of Nebraska, period. But there's actually this, what I would call this Ohio, Nebraska, Colorado connection. And those are 3 distinct chapters, but they're all kind of looped in together because they're all tied in together. So the Ohio years are important years because both Johnny A. Cozad, another older brother, and Robert are born there in Cincinnati. There are 4 other children, all of whom die very young, that were also born in Ohio in a little town called Cozaddale. So Cozaddale was originally a town called Spencer's Station, and it's probably one of the most important legacies that John Cozad left behind, although at the end of the day, the town today, if you think Cozad or Red Cloud, where I live, is small, Cozaddale maybe has 100 people still left in it, so it's a tiny little place. But John Cozad purchased about 300 acres, platted it, and developed a small community there. He built this house, the house on the left there. It's an Italianate style brick house. And it had, and this is unusual in Italianate style houses, a very large tower on the front of it. That is so unusual for that style. The other thing, if you took that away and just looked at the brick building, that building looks an awful lot like our building does today. And if you took the tower away and you took all that bracketing across the top out, we have 4 floor-to-ceiling windows on the first floor of the museum on the front side, and the second floor of our building has 2 windows as well. John Cozad buys this land, plats it, builds some buildings, and he bought farmhouse, and it's just that little white piece at the back end of that building that was a farmhouse that he moved into in 1867, and then built this piece on the front of it a couple of years later. The house still exists, and it's a bed and breakfast if you're ever in downtown Cozaddale, and that's a picture of it there. Unfortunately, the tower was not maintained, and so they had to run it off. And then the map on top shows you what Cozaddale looked like there, and the property off to the right there, where the arrow says J.J. Cozad is where that large house. But you can see how big the town was. He divided all those plots out, and then it was right on the Marietta-Cincinnati Railroad. And it's one of these themes that you're going to see in Cozad's life. Of course, Union Pacific here, out there in Denver, it was that way, and in Ohio, it was the Marietta, and that's it. So we have in our collection at the museum 3 Robert Henri scrapbooks. One is from 1878, one is from 1879, and one is from 1877. And they reflect his time in Cozaddale, Ohio, and Nebraska and Denver. And it's kind of interesting to see what he thought was important. If you look really closely, I think you can see it there. It's the right-hand side here. It says Robert Henry Cozad, presented by his mama in January of 1878. So he would have been 13 years old with them. So his mother, every birthday, gave to him and his brother Johnny an empty scrapbook. Now there's some debate as to who filled them with the articles. The Henri biographers believe it was his mother that did these clippings out. I think it was Bob Cozad, what was that his name then, who did that, but no one really knows. But there are hundreds of pages in each of the scrapbooks, and they all have these little clippings. on the right-hand side. And they carry newspaper stories. There's in one of them, there's a poem about one of those Cozad children that died. There's something about him being a bad dancer. There's a picture of a dancing school where he could go for lessons. But they're kind of an interesting insight to see what this young boy, 13, 14, 15, was thinking about at that time. Also, one of his report cards is there. He was late a number of times. He was very bad at spelling, which is reflected not only in these, but in everything right to his paintings. And we have one of the paintings, Gypsy Girl. He spells gypsy differently, Gipsie. And so he misspelled that even, and that was in the 1920s. So you can see he's still a bad speller by that point, but it shows up in his report card. So between 1873 and 1884, Robert Henry Cozad and the Cozad family are here in Nebraska and live here in Cozad. And they are, and at least I've made this argument in my book, they're formative years. And if you think about the years between 8 and 19 in your own life and how formative they were, that is what they were to John, or to Robert Henry and Robert Cozad. And so Nebraska plays a really important part in this story. This is something that is not too much talked about, but there were native peoples here, and this south of here at the in Frontier County is the Medicine Creek Reservoir, about 60 miles south here. The oldest native peoples, the remains of, have been found at the Lucena Mammoth site, and some of the oldest Paleo-Indian, pre-Paleo-Indian sites in America have been found in different places here in Nebraska. It's not until the 1500s when what we now call the Pawnees, as that description were here. Prior to that, they were called the Proto-Pawnees. But it was the Pawnees who were still here when Robert Henry and Cozad. They were being forced onto reservations by that point. But this is a picture of one grouping of them in 1866, just down to a train station. So aside from an occasional interaction with European traders, the military expedition with Lewis and Clark, Nebraska, in terms of its history, doesn't play a major role in America's development until after Lewis and Clark for the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Lewis and Clark passed through on the Missouri River, and Zebulon Pike, who went on 3 expeditions for Thomas Jefferson, passed through not too far from where I live, Red Cloud. But soon after that 1803 expedition of Lewis and Clark came back, people now knew what was here. Platte River was a major, it was called the Great Platte River Road. And so soon it was attracting the attention, particularly Nebraska City, Omaha, and Lincoln on the eastern end of the state. Homesteaders began living there, moving there, and then moving west from there. Nebraska became a state in 1867, and John Cozad is said to have passed through here in 1872, so that gives you some context. Another piece of this story that we don't really, or have not in the past, told too much about, and I think is a pretty important part of the story, is we talked about the Pony Express, certainly because we have the Pony Express station right behind you in City Park, but that was a private mail carrier effort, and it was only in operation for 2 years, 1860 to 1861, and it was a way to connect the mails from the east to California and to the west, and that route passed through just south of Cozad. And then in the 1840s began this massive migration. Hundreds of thousands of people would pass either through Cozad or just south of Cozad on the Oregon and California trails and the Mormon trails. And those trails, and you can see the group of people here, they would go until the 1890s. The main use of the Oregon Trail kind of ended with the kind of when the railroad got here. but many people chose to still do this, to go this route. It took months to get across from Missouri out to Oregon or California. And then on the northern side of the Platte was the Mormon Trail. That's present-day Highway 30. And you can pretty much follow that route still. One of the things I've discovered in my book, I had always presumed that Highway 30 was actually the route of the Mormon Trail, but it was actually on the north side, or I'm sorry, south side of between the railroad and the river. So it's not, I mean, they had to mark somewhere and you can't drive on the south side of the tracks, but that's where it actually was. And we've got survey maps to show that. This is a great picture because it shows you the Mormon hand carts that were used just for a couple of years' time, but they packed enough material. Each person was given 45 pounds, every person, and then 10 of you were assigned to a hand cart, and one person could pull it on their own. And this was only used for a short while, but then you can see there's other wagons in the back there. But the Mormons designed this whole system to get people there to Salt Lake. And if you're not familiar, the Mormons started upstate New York. They wound up in Nauvoo, Illinois, to create this town at Nauvoo. The anti-Mormon folks burned the entire town down. They moved to, or come to West Omaha to what became known as the Wintering Quarters, great museum there if you're ever over that way in Omaha. And then from there, took that first summer, went out to Salt Lake, established a route, and it was on the north side of the Platte, and then just thousands more came through as time went on. So, but the hand carts are, I think, one of the most fascinating parts about this. And it was actually much easier to do that than to have a wagon. Now, I don't know if you could fit 45 pounds of your stuff, or if you could condense your stuff to 45 pounds. Think about that. But that's what they were able to do. And the other tombstone there is over in Kennesaw, which is to the west of Hastings. And I think her name was Susan Hale. And the tradition is that she died there. Her husband walked all the way back to Omaha, had a tombstone made, and dragged it all the way back in the wheelbarrow. I don't know if that's true or not. And then he caught up with the family as they moved on. But that monument is still there, and it sits on a hilltop there just outside of Kennesaw. And then if you're interested in finding the Oregon Trail, right here in Cozad, you can't see it anymore. It's been farmed over, it's flat. But you can see this, what's called a swale. This is down in Fairbury. And you can walk about, I would say, half a mile of this swale. This is the Pony Express, California Oregon Trails, all converged right there. But you can see that dip in the ground there, and that is where the wagons went. And what's happened over time is that has continued to erode, so it's actually been preserved and it wasn't farmed. That's what really disappeared the Oregon Trail off farm. So in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signs the Transcontinental Railroad Act, and so begins this race to connect the East with the West. One of the landmarks in that legislation was that the railroads, before they could get money and land from the Union Pacific, they had to get to the 100th meridian. And that doesn't mean just Cozad. The 100th meridian goes all the way to Texas, goes all the way to Canada. So the Burlington Northern, for example, got to the 100th meridian much further south, or the Burlington Missouri River. But that was the goal. And if any railroad got to the 100th meridian, they would get what wound up to be millions of acres of ground. And so one of the reasons that John Cozad came here was because the Union Pacific wanted to establish a community on the meridian. So in 1862, and then it was stopped somewhat by the Civil War, the Union Pacific begins its construction of the railroad from Omaha out to here and makes its way across Nebraska. And this is what it looked like, that first original railroad. Now it's 3 tracks, but it was only one. And you can see how they just brought that dirt up, put ties down, had one flat side to it, and then this guy is surveying it, and then eventually they'll lay track on it. It was not until the early 1900s they actually had a second rail, not a third rail after that. So in October of 1866, the construction crew arrives through what became Cozad. It was led by a horse called Blind Tom, and Blind Tom was really blind. And so the guys had to guide him, but he was a great horse. If he was out front, he would drag the rails and ties out, and they would build the track and continue on. And Blind Tom made his way most of the way across Nebraska. So he passed through here at one point. As the railroad was getting closer to the 100th meridian, the Union Pacific itself realized that this was a great publicity move to say that they had got. And so they brought a trainload of prominent people, congressmen, there was a future president on that train. There was the governor of Nebraska at that point, or the future governor of Nebraska. And so they all came on the train, you can see there, and they came to, that's the original sign that stood there, the 100th meridian, probably there until the 1880s. They stopped there. They had their pictures taken. One of the people on the train was Robert Todd Lincoln. Now that's a son of Abraham Lincoln, and this is only a year and a half after his father had been assassinated. Robert Todd Lincoln would go on to become very prominent in the federal government. But that's a picture that was taken here at the 100th meridian with that train in October of '66. And there were actually many people on the train. This is just one picture of it. And if you go to the Library of Congress's webpage, you can actually see there's probably 50 different pictures of that event and all these people there. You can see where it says nose of the managers, the railroad stand. So beginning in the 1860s, cattlemen from Texas began bringing their cattle, driving their herds north to Nebraska and then beyond us to up along the Loup River to prepare them for market, and then they would get shipped out east from Plum Creek, or now Lexington. The cattlemen, when they came here, there was nobody here. So it was wide open. They could run these. I read that one of those herds was 10,000 cattle, and they could just push them up without worrying about fencing or people or houses or anything. And so they did not want homesteaders here from the very beginning. And so pretty quick, they were here, the homesteaders were here, and that became troublesome. The disputes between cowboys, the cattlemen, the homesteaders sometimes could turn violent. There were the two men that were killed up towards Oconto, were Callaway, and they were two homesteaders, and it was said they'd stolen cattle. They were lynched and killed, and their bodies were burned, hanging from the trees. Terrible, terrible thing. This is a picture by Solomon Butcher. He was a very well-known photographer from Custer County, and this is a great picture because it's of cowboys, of course. But if you look at the guy's gun, he scratched in the flame of it being fired. So, and so the guy is jumping when there's really nothing to jump at. It looks like that. So beginning in the 1860s, this area was surveyed. We have the surveys for Cozad before it became Cozad. And after that, they began to announce that Nebraska land was for sale. And it was in 1872, just 6 years after the train had come through, that John Cozad passed through the valley and decided that he wanted to build a community here now as well. And so he began discussions with the Union Pacific Railroad officials in Omaha to buy acreage here. In the end, he bought 40,000 acres. And this map is just a map of what he sold when they left here. And this is about 5,000 acres. So you can just see how big 40,000 acres. It went almost over to Willow Island, parts of it, and almost over to what Dar. But this shows you what the land looked like, the 5,000 acres looked like when it sold. So John Cozad began to post these kinds of broadsheets there back east. And there has been some thought that Robert Cozad printed these. I have my doubts. I think it's done by commercial printers. It's such a big thing. And it has David Claypool's name on the bottom, but David Claypool was the editor of the newspaper here. But this was typical of the advertisements that John Cozad did. The other thing, and you can't read it really, but one of the things that strikes me about this poster, we always think of John Cozad as promoting homesteaders. But in this case, if you read that closely, he also proposed the cattlemen out here too, as well, not just the homesteaders. So initially, and it was the case with John Cozad as well, but initially when people came here, they built soddies for sod houses, and that was what was built right around where the train station is today, at least in that first winter they were here. It's, as you can see there, this person described it as Nebraska brick. And this person is standing next to his first, as he says here, his first house in Nebraska. You know, I don't know how many of you can go over and see a sod house over in Gothenburg. And if you could just imagine snakes popping their heads out through the grass, or cows walking on top of it, sometimes collapsing the roofs, dirt floors, it's probably not a pleasant experience. That picture was a Solomon Butcher picture. This one is as well. And I love this picture because it's a reenactment of what happened to the original settlers here when they were faced with the grasshopper plagues 3 years, from 76 to 78. And so this guy's holding a branch, trying to show how he swept away grasshoppers and his cornfield there, which would have been impossible. The grasshoppers were so thick, they ate everything in sight. They ate broom handles. If you didn't have a window closed, forget it. They came in. They got onto railroad tracks, and the tracks were so slippery with grasshoppers that the train got stuck. They couldn't even move. But I love this picture because it's a reenactment of that 1876 to 78 at the time. And the little grasshoppers that you see in that picture, it's hard to see it here, but if you looked at the glass negative, you could see he scratched all the little grasshoppers there. So this is what Cozad looked like in 1873 when John Cozad first came. And they come in December of 1873. It must have been a terrible time to start to come out here to build these places, but they put in some sod houses, and then by the next spring, they're bringing in timber. And the building with the false front, white false front to it, is, I think, the first hotel, called the Immigrant Hotel. And the rest of those buildings were just right around there. And the caboose there to the lower right was the first train station here in Cozad, and it had Cozad painted on it. Another one was built, it burned to the ground. The third one is still here, I think, just down the street. And then the fourth one is the current one. But that is what Cozad looked like at the very outset, from probably 73 to 76. There has been, and I think I have it right, but there's been a lot of debate about when our museum building was built. Some have said it was built in 1876, although I have never found anything to say that, but people have written letters and so on. But we do know for sure that the Riggs family moved into the building in 1879. That we're absolutely positive. And this is what the building looked like in the 1890s. But this is, I think that this is exactly what the building looked like. And you can, if you look closely, you'll see it's brick, but there's no stucco on the brick, which there is now. The other thing that's fascinating about this picture to me is that the window, actually that's where my office is there on the left side, that has shutters on it, which would have made sense. You would have wanted shutters to close up on any time. And then some of the windows towards the front side of the building on this end that you're looking at had not yet been put there. So a picture like this for a historian, architectural historian, does a lot for us because we can tell so much from that. But you can also see the discoloration in the brick as well. And remember, the brick was made out of Traver Gatewoods brickyard, which is just beyond where the cemetery, that cemetery is. And this picture is from 1890. It said of a Cozad coronet van standing right there in the street. But it does give you a lot of information for us, for me as a historian writing history of the building. So The earliest known image that we do have is the floor plan that Robert Henry Cozad drew in 1880. And this is probably the single most valuable document that we have in terms of the building, because from this we can tell where windows and doors were added, changed, and so there were more doors on the building than are now. There out here where it says window and door on the right hand side of the offices. There's not a door there now. There's a door where it says window down at the bottom of the door right there. All those changes got made over time. But this is what the building would have looked like, we know, in the spring of 1880. So it's a really important historical document. And you can see where it says my office, that's Henry's or Robert Cozad's office. And the other interesting thing, the kitchen there on the big end, back end of the building, today it's a continuous piece off of the main building. It was not then. You can see there was a breezeway between the two buildings. And I think that either the kitchen burned to the ground, was demolished or dilapidated, and then what we have today was built after. But again, this is the kind of information that you get out of these kinds of documents. And so that was the beginnings of our community. And this house, I believe this is the house right across the northwest corner of City Park. It's painted green. And I think that that's this house. And this is David Claypool's house, Claypool's original founders of Cozad. They were related by marriage to John Cozad. And there's 3 generations of Claypools sitting. But someday when you drive by that house, remember this picture. That's what someday I have to go over there and just take the picture over. But I don't want to get the people who live in it mad, because I'll be standing there looking at it, all the rest. So John Cozad is, the best word I can describe him is an enigma. I go from thinking he's a visionary to being arrogant and haughty, to being a speculator, a gambler. It is said, and I have found no evidence for this, but it's said that when John Cozad came here, he dictated there would be no saloons, gambling, or guns. That is the story that Mary Sandoz tells, and it's the one that I'm sure all of you have heard as well. He may have started out that way, but in 1880, I know there are saloons here because Robert Cozad writes it in his diary. So whatever he started at the beginning didn't turn out to be what it was in the end. And it became a different kind of town, I think, than what he really wanted at the beginning. So this business of an enigma comes to something like this. So a group of Presbyterian leaders come here at this time. This is in the early 1800s. And John Cozad promises to give them a plot of land for a parsonage and a church. The lot number that he chose to give them is not the lot number that the Presbyterian Church ultimately built on. I don't know why that got changed. But it was very common for founders of towns, if they were corporations or individuals, to set aside lots for a town square and to set aside land for churches. So you could go to that founder or company and say, I want to build a Presbyterian church, Methodist church, Episcopal church, and they would give you a lot to do that. And so this is very much an example of that. And John Cozad said, when you're ready to build, let me know, and we'll do the paperwork, and that's it. And that never happened. The Presbyterian church was not built on this lot. It was built, as you know, on the corner, and it was built much later. I want to say, but this is the example of this kind of different side of John Cozad. He supported his early settlers. After one of those grasshopper seasons, he bought corn and seed for the farmers so they could plant, and gave it to them. Because he obviously wanted this community to go forward, but he didn't have to do that. I mean, there is some generosity, I think, on his part to do that. And probably his greatest, I would say, sense of generosity and community spirit would have been in building the bridge across the Platte River. So we go across on a bridge now. It's a new bridge, but there was a bridge prior to that, and then there was a bridge prior to that. John Cozad, if you ever go over the bridge down to the south and look on each side of both the Platts, north and south Platts, you'll see this runway coming up to the bridge on your, it would be on the eastern side. John Cozad built it. And then he built some of the bridge, and those pilings that you see there, a couple of those might even be John Cozad's pilings. If you're ever going to the east of this in a boat where the river gets really low, look in the mud, because one of his boats is still buried in the mud there from a flood. So it was the boat that drove pilings into the river. But when John Cozad decided to build this bridge, he knew that he had to connect the south side of the Platte River with Cozad. Otherwise, all that business was going over to Plum Creek because there was already a bridge. And so it was critical for him to create this bridge. And he wanted the county to pay for it. That did not happen. A referendum happened to let him build. The people of Cozad voted for it. And then the Union Pacific filed suit to stop him from building because they didn't want to be taxed for it. So he spends, the guesses are anywhere between $20,000 and $50,000, which is a lot of cash in 1880, 1881 to build this bridge. And what he wanted to do was to narrow the Platte River down in several sections, build a wood bridge across it, and have solid abutments. And what happened is it just got flooded out several times. That was the end. Stephen Henry came in and buys all this land from Cozads. 6 months later, he had a bridge up, and 2 years later, the county bought it. So it just shows you maybe the difference in personalities or whatever that might be. So John Cozad had certainly lots of troubles. He shot people. He was shot. He got off the train here in Cozad one day, and his face was entirely in a plaster, a cast mask, because somebody had broken his jaw in Cincinnati. He was disliked by the people here, many of them at least. And as the years went by, more and more newcomers came into the area. They had no tie to John Cozad whatsoever. In 1881, after having not paid taxes on any of his 40,000 acres for 7 years, he left for Denver. And I think for the locals at that point, that was the final straw, so much to the point that they changed the name of the town from Cozad to Gould. And for about 5 years, that was the case. And you can see Gould there. So you would get off in Cozad, but you could go to the Gould post office to mail something, go back to the Cozad, and then back on the train. The railroad never did change the name. They always kept it at Cozad. And the townspeople who named it Gould did that because they thought they could attract the attention of Jay Gould, who was the president of the Union Pacific Railroad. But in the end, that did not happen, and it went back to Cozad about 5 years later. So many of the family members, that is, the members of the, not Cozad family, but the Henry group of family members, did not believe that they ever wound up in Colorado, because I've seen their letters. This is 2 or 3 generations. And it may have been because they were there for such a short time, they didn't believe that they had been there. But there are these Colorado years from 1881 to 1883. And so in 81, Denver is not what we know it to be today. It was an up-and-coming city. The state of Colorado had only become a state not that many decades before. And the Cozads had already established a hay business. So they were cutting all this hay along the Platte, South Platte, and shipping it out to Leadville, which is where the mines were, to feed the livestock there. They had also decided that both of their boys should get a better education than what they could get here in Cozad, which was then just a one school. And John Cozad had an interest in the lead mine in Leadville. So that's what took them to Colorado. And this is a map of what Denver looked like. And there is, and I haven't yet got this down, but there is a Cozad edition in Denver. It's down towards Laramie Street, which is down towards the state capitol building. And I'm trying to see if that's our Cozad. So when they first get to Colorado, they open, John and his sons open a storefront there on Laramie Street. All this is gone now. There's nothing left there. And then ultimately they moved over to Lake Street, which was just a couple blocks away. But that's where they, apparently this building, the blue building in the center was their office. One of the buildings on the side was a residence. And of course, the story that you know and the story that all of us have heard about, our visitors, many have heard this story, is the shooting of Al Pearson. And I'm not going to say much about this because next month I'm talking about that and I have a whole detailed story about it. But just quickly, John Cozad comes back in from Denver. Al Pearson comes into town when he hears he's in town. And much of what's known about Al Pearson, what you think you know about Al Pearson, is probably wrong. He was a deputy sheriff, a rancher. He was a former employee on Cozad's Bridge project. He was a Quaker. And both of these guys, Cozad and Pearson, are tough people used to adversity. And they begin to have this argument in front of Julia Gatewood, and John Cozad says, let's go out on the porch. And as soon as he got out on the porch, Al Pearson hit him so hard that he dropped into a shipping box, and was beating the heck out of John Cozad. And I have read in one of the accounts that Al Pearson said to John Cozad, you know, I'm going to cut your lying tongue out of your mouth. And so John Cozad pulled a pistol out, shot him in the face. So that's how that kind of ended. And then 3 weeks later, Pearson was dead, but Cozad would be indicted for murder of Pearson, but he also left town that night that this shooting happened. One of the great mysteries, and even to this day, we really are not quite sure, is where John Cozad went that night. I think it's generally agreed that he went south to the Burlington, Missouri Railroad, which is about 50 miles south of here. And then the question becomes, where did he go from there? Go east, go west? The biographers all say he went to Denver. I don't believe that. And I don't believe it because within a week, the governor had issued an arrest warrant for him. And even though you think of Denver being that far away, and Colorado being that far away, it was very possible that he could have been arrested within a couple of days. So the idea that he went to Denver, stayed there a few months, tried to decide what they were going to do, just doesn't make sense to me. That's what the biographers say. So I think he had maybe 3 options. One was to go to Chicago, one was to go back to Cozaddale, and then one was to go where he did go in Canada, to New York City, and where he finally did wind up. One of the people who we have evidence from suggests that he went back to Cozaddale, was hiding in that big tower when the Nebraska sheriff showed up at the front door of the house looking for him. I just can't believe they would have sent somebody to Ohio to try to track him down. But there were detectives in St. Louis looking for him. There were sightings of him in Deadwood, South Dakota. Who knows? And we still don't know to this day. And for 7 months, everyone agrees he just disappeared. So where he went, as I say, none of us know. But right after that, I mean, 3 weeks after, Johnny Cozad creates this firebomb, and as I mentioned, tried to burn down the hotel. The reason that that's so relevant to the story is not only because the historians have gotten this wrong, they said we burned the house down, which did not happen. But Johnny Cozad was arrested a day later. So it just shows you, when the arrest warrant was put out, it just shows you how quickly the law could come into effect. And John Cozad was much better known than Johnny Cozad. So, but this is this drawing here. You don't see the caption, but the caption says that building number 9, which is the Johnson house where John was staying. It says in the caption, Johnny Cozad burned this building to the ground, and that never happened. Which might also mean why Johnny Cozad never came back to face justice, because he knew that, you know, if they were making that accusation, the building hadn't burned down. Probably wasn't a good sign for him. So Johnny and John Cozad are gone, and now Teresa and Robert are stuck with having to deal with the 5,000 acres and other properties in downtown. They continue to live in Colorado for a while, sell all the Colorado properties, I think, come back here to Cozad. And ultimately they took advertisements out in Eastern newspapers to sell all that land. And a man named Stephen Henry, and you can see there the Henry house. Stephen Henry was a major and wealthy businessman in Illinois, Bushnell, and he owned that hotel, I don't know, 7 or 8 granaries. I mean, he was a very, very wealthy, astute business person. He saw that ad and came out here, met with Teresa Cozad, and decided to buy the 5,000 acres and what the building is now, the museum. But he did not trust the Cozads, any good reason not to. For one thing, the Cozads in the Gatewoods were constantly moving property back and forth, their deeds. And they had just moved the museum deed back and forth after Al Pearson died. It was transferred from the Cozads to the Gatewoods because the Pearson family tried to put liens on the Cozad properties because the father had been killed. Anyway, Stephen Henry decides to buy the property and all the 5,000 acres in the building. He signs a contract with Teresa Cozad and Robert Henry Cozad, who's only 18, but he's acting as Teresa's attorney in fact. And he must have been uncomfortable with the fact that John Cozad had not signed the contract. So he told Teresa he wasn't going to do anything until John signed the contract. Of course, he's gone and he's wanted for murder. So it's not like he's just going to come into town and sign a deed and go back to wherever he was from. But that's how Stephen Henry and how the Henry name came into it. And with a payment in gold of $20,000, which was an awful lot of money in gold, because the Cozads didn't want to take a check because that could be traced. And because of Al Pearson's, his estates liens against the Cozads, $5,000 of that gold was kept here in Cozad and $15,000 given to Robert and Teresa. They sell the gold, sew the gold into their clothes and leave in the middle of the night. And Sam Schooley, who carried that pistol they see there, it's on display in our museum, he got them out of town and he did what John Cozad did, went 50 miles to the south. And again, no one knows east, west, wherever. My own feeling is that they didn't go to Denver, that they went east and maybe took a variety of things like Chicago and a couple other places. But that's the routes that I think are possible they may have taken. So once again, there is this amongst the biographers, this debate about what happened. They go to Denver, they go to New York, they go to Atlantic City. One of the biographers, it may be Mary Sandoz, wrote that after Al Pearson was shot, John Cozad, Teresa Cozad were on the second floor of the Beehive. That was the building Pearson was shot at, and that was where Claude Barracoon's building is now. It's gone now, but that's where the building was. And they came up with this elaborate plan to change their names and do all that. I just don't think that's the way it happened. I think that they were wanting to get John out of here as quickly as possible. And Teresa was worried about what was going to happen. Her husband's all bloodied up, shirts are bloody, shirt is bloody. But the biographers argue that they went to New York. Robert was put in school, Johnny was put in school there, and then they moved to Atlantic City and ultimately brought Johnny and Robert to Atlantic City. So at some point, and that's where we're not clear, they came up with totally new identities. And so John Cozad became Richard Lee, Teresa Cozad became Tess Lee, Robert Henry Cozad became Robert Earl Henry, and Johnny Cozad became Frank Southern. Both of the boys were now foster children of the parents, and they would maintain that facade for the rest of their lives. Even Johnny Cozad's death certificate said he was born in 1858, which was 4 years before he was actually born, and said he was born in Mexico. Well, he was born in Cincinnati, but they maintained that full false image until the very end. They go to Atlantic City, that building right in the center there. It's called, you can see it's called Lee's Pavilion. John Cozad once again went to work on real estate. There was a train station 2 blocks away. Atlantic City was this up and coming, booming town. John Cozad made a lot of money there. Also was involved with controversy there too as well. They wanted to widen the boardwalk, and it came down, and you can even see it. The boardwalk was 40 feet wide, they enlarged, and the next section down is only 20 feet wide. Well, they wanted to widen it 40 feet all the way beyond his place because they had so many people there. John Cozad refused, went to court, hung him up in court, and he carried 2 6-shooters, the big 10-gallon hat on the boardwalk, and he put at each end of the Lee's Pavilion these big pipes with wheels on them that looked like cannons. So as you were coming down the board, you had 2 cannons looking straight at you. You would have thought, I would have thought, he would want to be a little quiet, low key, because he's wanted for murder, just not too far away, but that was not John Cozad. It's also there in Atlantic City that Robert begins to paint, and his first paintings are done there. And we have one of the sketches from that time when he got there. And I think it was before. So this Nebraska legacy is a fascinating one to me, because I would bet you've all been to the museum, but I would bet if I asked most about Robert Henry, it's, oh yeah, his father shot Al Pearson. And many of our visitors that are from Nebraska in particular say that. Not that he was one of the world's greatest painters, not that he was one of the greatest art instructors, not that he wrote the greatest art instruction book ever in the 20th century. None of that matters. It's that he shot Al Pearson. But we're trying to change that picture, of course. I'm determined, as some of you heard me speak the last time, to find the connection between Willa Cather and Robert. And there are these different pieces. You might recall she wrote My Antonia. It's the book of the book you're reading, what, Lost Lady?
The Lost Lady.
Which is about Silas Garber, who was the governor of Nebraska, who's buried, by the way, in Red Cloud. But that's one of the connections that I want to track down. The other is, this is what Robert Henry looked like when he came to Nebraska when he was 8 years old. And while there is no picture of him here at the end of his life or in the years after, this is probably when he's maybe 20, 21 years old. But I think that's probably a good picture of what he probably looked like here as well. There is some record of his time here. He wrote a letter to the editor. It's his first person account of what it was like to live here. And the 100th Meridian then played a very important part in the community's life. It's not so much, I mean, we talk about being on 100th Meridian, but in those days, that was a really significant thing to talk about. He talks about the grasshoppers, but they're doing mostly the harvesting, not people. He's talking about the air being pure and healthy. Nobody ever gets sick. Well, I wish that was the case, but winter is mild. Now, I just can't. When I saw that the first time, I thought, oh, no, that's just not true. But this was a letter that he published in the 100th Meridian newspaper, and that newspaper went out back east to Ohio to convince people to move here. The other thing about this legacy is that Robert Henry began to sketch while he was here. Mary Sandow says she saw some of his sketches up in Chadron from a cowboy who had worked for John Cozad. These are just excerpts of some of his pages from diary, so you can see some of the scribblings. We have his signature there, RHC, that's written on a plaster wall there at the museum. So a lot of that happened here. So Nebraska is a significant part of his life, I think. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the director of the museum, but I truly believe that. And here are 2 sketches that kind of give us a better timeline. So the one of the Swan, and I digitized it so it's black and white. The one of the Swan was done March of 1884, which means that Henry was still here. Now, all of the biographers believe he's long gone. But they only sold the property in February, which that's why that's relevant. And the picture on the right is the sketch that we own. It's the oldest sketch that we have. And that sketch was done in December of 1884 and signed Robert Henry. So that means we know by that point. So in the years that followed his death in 1929, a major show of his work in New York and Baltimore. And this quote here was written by the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art. And one of the things that strikes me about this quote is that line that reads, "A pioneer ever ready to explore." Now, when Mr. McKinney wrote that, he was thinking pioneer in the sense of going out and starting new, creating a new path. But for Robert Henry, that would have had a double meaning because he could remember those people being on the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon trails. So he would have had a better understanding of that word. That would have meant something to him. And then, of course, the story of how this all came to be known. Robert Henry dies in 1929. There's only 2 or 3 people alive at that point that know his Nebraska roots. One of them was his wife, who died a year later than Henry did. But John Sloan was his best friend. John Sloan, one of the great artists at that time. His wife believed that he was a better artist than Henry. I don't know if that's jealousy or what that is speaking. But in 1951, John Sloan dies. And in 1955, Van Wyck Brooks writes Sloan's biography. And in that biography in 1955, there is one page, and he says in that page, Robert Henry was from Nebraska. His father killed him. That's the first time the world, so to speak, the United States, the world knew that part of the story. Until then, no one knew. 5 years later, Mary Sandoz comes out with her book, Son of the Gambling Man. And then in 1956, also there is this newspaper that was published here at the local in Cozad, and that is we give that away at the museum. That reveals kind of like the true story of the whole Cozad story. And then lastly, our museum has been saving this Henry legacy for a long time. This is a picture of the building before it was stuccoed over. You can see some of the brick work there. It's been damaged by time. This is what the building looked like when we took it over. It was really, I marvel every time I walk through there, the courage and the stamina of the people. Shirley Paulson, all that crew of Cozad grandmothers, Marlene, all these people who gave of their time and their effort to save that building. Look, these ladies cleaned up where they're just, it's really remarkable. At the time we purchased or acquired the school, the church, built the historic walkway, the Pioneer or the Pony Express station was already in the park. And ever since then, we have been collectively, now 40 years of people have been saving this building. And there is nothing cheap to be done in this building. We put 4 HVAC systems in, that was $45,000. We just put storm windows on, that was $25,000. It just never ends, it keeps on going. And then of course we built the new gallery in 2014, and Larry Carty might have built that, and there's Jan Patterson out there. Her initials are inscribed in concrete underneath the carpet. If you ever see the carpet get pulled up, like her name there. And as to the architectural legacy of the Cozad and the time here, there are only a handful of buildings still left in our town that go back to the Cozad time. This pink house was the house that Robert and Julia Gatewood lived in. Moved up there. This building was across the street from our museum of parking lot. I mentioned David Claypool's house, and this other house, the right, Sam Schooley's house. This is Caddy Corner across from the Grand Generation Center, and that building was moved a couple of blocks. It was over by Garcia Market. So And so today we're still telling the story. We've been host to lots of groups, lots of individual students. There's Marlene talking, former Lieutenant Governor. Chuck's doing a tour, I'm doing a tour. We get thousands of people a year coming through. This year we're on the Nebraska passport, so we expect even more people. And finally, probably in September, my book will be out. And this is the cover that's going to look like. And it's our plan to have a book signing in December. But it's our hope that this will now become, if you become a volunteer at our museum, we're going to hand you that 500-page book. I wouldn't want to be that guy to have to read it, but you're going to hand that book to the guy, to the new guy who goes and say, this is your assignment if you want to be a volunteer, which will probably turn a lot of people off. So lastly, John Cozad, when he picked Cozad to settle, he envisioned that people from Chicago, New York, Denver, and California would be on this great platform, which is exactly where Route 80 and 76 are today. And so the route that he saw as the future of the country in the 1870s is still that. And the vast majority of our visitors also come off of the interstate as well. So thank you. And I'll be glad to answer any questions if you have any questions. And if not, then that's our program for the evening. Here, I'll go around it.
Does anybody have any questions for Peter? Okay, you have to wake up first.
Sorry, Dave.
How did he put together that block of land that you showed? And my whole understanding of it is the Union Pacific only got every other section.
So he purchased a lot of land. So there were two sections in the original.
Bought that from the federal government.
Or from other people. So the southern half of Cozad, section 7, which would be where the museum is, that section was UP land. The next section up had been purchased by somebody who was going to homestead the whole section, Marcus Long, I think his name was. And he sold that to John Cozad less than a year after Cozad died. So that's how that could have. The other thing is that Cozad was the only land all the time. So he bought 40,000 acres from the Pacific, but he swapped land, traded land. And one of the things, Dave, that I think could be done, it's not going to be me because it's too complicated, but is to do a serious study of his land purchases, because they go from here to Dar, from here to Willow Island, and every other section is your point out. And he, some of that land at one point, 3 or 4 years in, he has not paid those taxes. And the Union Pacific required that he pay the taxes because they're the ones that are hurting because they got to make it up, essentially. And so what happens is that the Union Pacific sues him, and I cannot get all the answers as to what happened. I do know that John Cozad paid them and got new deeds, but he almost lost all this in Cozad because of it. And I think that would, I don't know if it's a book, but it's certainly worth study. Because 40,000 acres, that's a lot of sections to try to track each of them out. He buys a quarter section here, he buys a half section there. And to do 40,000 acres would be a lot. And he still had 5,000 to end. But I think that would be a great project. Now, Laura Rohde here at the library is working on some of this. And she gave me copies of all her research, particularly the first purchases of the land. And then I found all the surveying maps from the state of Nebraska's surveying office. And it's amazing to look at those maps. I mean, they plotted everything out from Omaha all the way to the western end of the state. And it just shows where the sections are. There's nothing there. And it shows the Oregon Trail and Mormon Trail. And it might show some unique geological features, stream or river. But what Laura did is really valuable. And somebody, maybe she'll do it, I don't know. But somebody ought to take all that data and try to figure it out. Because the one sentence that I say every time that I cannot prove, and no one has been able to prove it, is a John Cozad bought 40,000 acres from UP. I have never seen that in any legal records at all, and it makes me wonder. I do have just one sentence from Teresa Cozad's note. It's written in 1923, it's right around the time she dies. And she said, we owned 20,000 acres in 1873 in Nebraska. Just that one sentence. And she was, by that point, an elderly woman. So I wondered if she remembered that correctly or not. Maybe they bought 20,000 at one time or 20,000 later. If you read The Battle of the Bridges by Rex Gurman and the fellow who's a director over there in Dawson County, he kind of alludes to the fact, they both allude to the fact it was bought in sections, so it was not just 140,000 purchase. So, and that's what I think we're fine. Somebody, I just don't have it in me to figure it all out. So it'd make a great project, David, to open something new. But the problem, Dave, and this is why it's not so important to me, is so if you did all that research and I proved where he got the 40,000, where it all went, who cares? I'm gonna bring that to a slide. You're all gonna be sleeping. But that would be a good research. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lori.
Yes, and thank you. And you talked a little bit about the Pony Express, so I just wanted to throw it out that we are having Matt Weiss from Gothenburg come over on March 22nd, I want to say, and he is doing a presentation about the Pony Express. So there are newsletters out at our front station if you want to pick one up and to see everything else going on. So
And
thank you all for coming.
He'll be a great speaker.
Yeah.
No.
Can you put that first slide up?
Yeah, sure.
That'd be something to
Yeah, I know. I just kind of like.